following is a production of the Dallas Genealogical Society.
So Lisa, if you want to come on up and introduce our speaker.
Steven Butler is a Dallas native whose family first came to Texas in 1846 and then arrived in Dallas in 1891. Unless you count his third cousin, 6 times removed, John Neely Bryan, who got here some 50 years earlier. Dr. Butler is an associate professor of history at Richland College in Dallas and Cullen College in Plano. He earned his PhD in transatlantic history at the University of Texas at Arlington. In his capacity as historian and writer, he has contributed 10 articles since 1989 to Legacies, a history journal for Dallas and North Central Texas, and presented 2 papers at the annual Dallas History Conference. 16 of his articles have been published in the U.S. history textbook currently being used by Richland College students. In 2004, his book, From Water Supply to Urban Oasis, was used as the basis for the permanent displays at the White Rock Lake Museum. In 1998, Dr. Butler was an unpaid but credited advisor to the PBS documentary, The U.S.-Mexican War, and in 2006, he appeared in a documentary about the State Fair of Texas called A Fair to Remember. From time to time, he shows up on KDRA-TV, Channel 13, whenever the station needs to fill 10 minutes, and uses his Art and Seek program appearance about the art of Fair Park, which originally aired in October 2009. Dr. Butler is an experienced family historian, a term he prefers to genealogist, who has spent as much of his spare time as he could over the past 40 years tracking down his ancestors. Dr. Butler has also offered to raffle off one of his books. He brought one today, so if you'll just stick around for a few minutes after his discussion, we'll do the raffle. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Lisa, for that wonderful introduction. This is the 3rd or 4th time I've spoken here at the Dallas Genealogical Society meeting in this room. I can't keep track of it. There's a lot of things I can't keep track of anymore. Gee, I hardly know where to begin. There's so much to tell you. I was reminded, too, I'll just mention this real quick and then I'll get into the presentation. As I was looking down here at the lectern, I was noticing it's the Dallas Public Library. And I started thinking about when did I first start going to a Dallas Public Library. I was quite young, actually. I was probably 4 or 5 or 6 years old. And my father, who is with us today, that's him back there with the Navy hat on, Navy cap on. My 89-year-old father, nearly 90, used to take me to the Lakewood Library on Saturdays. We'd go to the kids show at the Lakewood Theater. This is back in the 50s, and then we'd go to the library afterwards, and I'd leave with a big stack of books. So I've been enjoying the Dallas Public Library for quite a long time. In fact, that's where I began my genealogical or family history research, was at the Dallas Public. Not this one, though, the one on Harwood Street. Anyway, but I came here to talk about John Neely Bryan. And to be honest with you, I'm not going to talk a lot about him. I am going to speak about him, obviously, but I don't want to give away too much or you won't buy my book. Let me, first of all, tell you how I came to write what is, as far as I know, the first ever comprehensive scholarly volume about biography of John Neely Bryan. And let me go to the next slide. There we go. That's me, believe it or not, on May 14th, 1990, when I portrayed John Neely Bryan for the cabin rededication downtown. And at that time, I was a volunteer with the Dallas Historical Society. I don't know if any of you recall back in the 1980s, the Dallas Historical Society had from 1985 to 1990 or 91 a program called the Lone Star Adventure. And the way it worked is that volunteers like myself would dress up in costume and pretend to be characters from the Texas history or famous figures from Texas history. And And we did this mostly at the Hall of State in Fair Park, but sometimes we went out to schools. We performed out at Old City Park, or Dallas Heritage Village as it's called now, and other places. And most of the time I was Davy Crockett. But towards the end of the program, I started doing John Neely Bryan as well, and that's how I came to be invited by the county to come out and be a part of this cabin rededication after they'd done some work on it. And that was a real thrill for me because I'd been looking at that cabin since I was a little kid, you know, on the courthouse lawn. And that was the first time I ever got to go inside. And I'll just tell you, it's tiny. You heard about these tiny houses? You know, there's this trend for, I think this started the trend for tiny houses. Anyway, but I've been aware of John Neely Bryan since I can remember. I don't remember really when was the first time I ever heard about him, but he's somebody that I heard about all my life, and it wasn't until this time that I started to realize that I didn't really know that much about him. And in 1991, the 150th, or was it 60th, anniversary of Dallas came along. 150th anniversary of Dallas came along. And I decided that I would write a book about John Neely Bryan because I'd never seen one. And I wrote actually a pamphlet. I printed, I forget how many copies, there weren't that many, maybe 50 or 100, I forget. There was a Dallas history conference out at SMU. I went there, I sold a few of those pamphlets, and they quickly disappeared from view, which is good, because it was a rather amateurish attempt, I think, to do something. And then in 2006, when the 150th anniversary of the chartering of Dallas as a town occurred, it occurred to me that maybe I could do a better job. So I did. I started doing more research, and I got pretty far with it. But somewhere along the way, I dropped the ball, so to speak, or put it to one side, and I never followed through. So the book that I finally did publish, and here's what it looks like, last year in 2016, is the culmination then of about 25 years of on and off research and work. So there we go. It was a long time coming, let's put it that way. Now, why did I decide to do this? Well, because apparently nobody else had ever done it. Or had they? Let me introduce you to Lucy Trent. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Lucy C. Trent. Lucy C. Trent is the only person, other than myself, who's ever written a whole book about John Neely Bryan. Not just a book that included bits and pieces about him. And I want to tell you a little bit about Trent. What's interesting is that she was not from Dallas, nor even from Texas. As I mentioned in my book here, she was born in Mississippi in 1871. Her maiden name was Lucy Payne. In 1893, she married a fellow named John Kritz. They had a daughter, Eileen. In 1926, after her first husband had died, she remarried. She married Albert Trent of Fayetteville, Arkansas. And in 1936, she came to Dallas, where she attended the dedication ceremonies for the cabin that has been attributed to John Neely Bryan. And while she was here, she conducted some research for her book, which has been criticized by other writers, most notably A.C. Green, the late Dallas Morning News columnist. He called it overly romanticized and erroneous. He wasn't far off. Another local historian deemed it questionable. And as I've written in my book, while there's some truth to these assessments, this does not mean that Trent's entire work is worthless. As I also wrote here, true, her biography of Bryan was romantic and flattering, and focusing primarily on the period prior to the founding of Dallas. She employed poetry, songs, and fictional dialogue to flesh out the little-known events of the man's early life. And what's interesting too, she seems to have purposely avoided some of the not so flattering and better recorded details of his later years. And she did make some mistakes, which I found. Now, this doesn't mean her book is entirely worthless, however. There is something good about it. Well, one of the things that I find good about Trent's book, and I have a copy, by the way, is that she talked a lot about his birth family, which a lot of other writers never did. She also brought in a lot of stories of his youth, which had never appeared in print anywhere else, either before or since. And she also named her sources. Although, as I put here in my book, although like nearly everyone else in the past who wrote about John Neely Bryan or Dallas history, she did not footnote her work. And so she did use some original items. She had a letter and a deed that were, supplied to her by some Bryan relatives. I don't know if I mentioned she is a Bryan relative. That's why she was interested in that. She interviewed some people who didn't necessarily know John Neely Bryan, but were in members of the family. And she referenced some of the written histories about John Neely Bryan. And so, as I also write in my introduction here, however informal it might have been, she did do some research. Now, I want to talk to you now about John William Rogers, the author of The Lusty Texans of Dallas. I'm sure you've all seen this book or read this book. This is more typical, as I write in my own book, of latter-day Bryan chroniclers. He does a great job of telling us about Bryan's adult life, and especially as it relates to the founding of Dallas. But he doesn't say a word about Bryan's younger days. But we have to remember, Rogers wasn't writing a biography of Bryan. He was writing a book about Dallas, the city he founded. And the same holds true of other writers, such as A.C. Green and Sam Addison. And here are some of the books that they wrote, that you've also probably seen these books. Dallas, The Deciding Years, 35,000 Days in Texas. That's actually about the Dallas Morning News. Dallas Yesterday, which is a compilation of Sam Atchison's columns in the Dallas Morning News. Anyway, all these people have blended stories about Dallas. Blended Bryan into their books about Dallas, but none of them actually ever wrote a book about him specifically. And there's something else about them. They all seem to have drawn on the same sources, because you read what they've written and you go, well, I read that somewhere else. And then you go back and you look, well, that's the same thing. So what people were doing was just simply repeating each other as you go along. Anyway, so what I've tried to do is I've tried to write a book that's complete. It's not piecemeal. It's not a little bit about this, a little bit about that. This is comprehensive. It covers his life from birth. It also talks about his family, some background about him. Oh, that reminds me. When I was introduced, it was mentioned that I was a distant cousin of John Neely Bryan. I used to make that claim. But let me elaborate on that just a little bit. A few years ago, I ran across some research done by another researcher that I took to be genuinely well researched, and so I made that claim. He said, yes, we are, And I made the mistake of accepting his research without actually looking at it very closely myself. And when I finally did get around to doing that, I discovered that there was a slight problem. It goes back to John Neely Bryan's grandfather, not his father, but his grandfather. His grandfather was supposedly a man named John Bryan, and trouble is, when you go back into the records, there's lots of John Bryans, and there seems to be some confusion about who's who. So let me just set the record straight here. I might be related to John Neely Bryan, but I don't know for sure, so I backed away from that claim. But at the same time, it's a possibility. It's a possibility. I just don't know for absolute certain. Anyway, what sets my book apart from Lucy Trent's, by the way, is first of all, it's much bigger. Her book was very small, very tiny. It was, I think it's 5 by 8. It's only about a quarter. It's more like a big pamphlet, a hardcover pamphlet, really, to be honest. And she says practically nothing about his life after he founds the city of Dallas. It's like, well, okay, he did all this stuff when he was young. He founded Dallas, end of story. Of course, there was a lot more to it than that. And of course, I've done this in a scholarly fashion. I've researched it. I have added endnotes, which are in the back of the book. And so if you ever want to check out my sources, you can do that, which is something no other writer about John Neely Bryan ever did. We never did. So what else? Okay. All right. I want to talk to you now, where did I get some of the information that I got? Well, I don't know if you've ever heard of Barrett Steven Sanders. He was, he's deceased now. He died in his 40s, back in sometime in the 1990s. He was a young man, close to my age, a little bit older than me, but not a lot, who was a local historian here in Dallas in the he was at his peak, I guess, back in the late 1970s, maybe 1980s. He also unsuccessfully ran for public office a few times. And this is the only pictures I could find of him from some old Dallas Morning News articles about him. He helped me out though, even though he also did not footnote his work, even though he wrote a book about Dallas and a big one, but there's no index. Don't you hate books that don't have an index? Anyway, so he was not, I don't think, a trained historian, but he did provide me with some clues. And one of the things he wrote about is that he said there was a magazine at one time called the American Sketchbook, and in the American Sketchbook was the earliest ever. This is about 1873, he said, the earliest sketch of Dallas that ever appeared anywhere. Now, trouble is, I've never been able to find a copy of that particular issue of the American Sketchbook. This is very difficult to find, and I have not yet been able to find it. But I think Sanders made a mistake because I think this did not appear in 1873. I think it didn't appear until 1878. So either he made a mistake or there's a typo, because maybe somebody typed a 3 instead of an 8. So I'm not 100% sure. So if that's the case, then this is actually the first printed story about Dallas. The Directory of Dallas, which was printed in 1875. It has a history of Dallas in this directory. 10 pages at the beginning of this city directory are devoted to the history of Dallas, and it's the first time that anybody mentioned John Neely Bryan, as far as I know, in print. Now, who wrote it? Well, that's a good question. The article is not The author of the article is not identified. I think it's one of two people. It's either John C. McCoy, who was an early day Dallas lawyer, who I'm sure you all have heard of, or it could have been John Henry Brown, which I want to talk about next. John Henry Brown came to Dallas in 1871. He had a long and eventful life as a soldier, a journalist, Texas state legislator, and a historian. And in addition to his oft-consulted history of Dallas County, Texas from 1837 to 1887, which was published in 1887, of course, he also wrote The Life and Times of Henry Smith, Indian Wars and Pioneers of Texas, and the History of Texas from 1685 to 1892. Upset by the Confederacy's defeat in the Civil War, Brown lived in Mexico for 6 years afterwards, returning to the U.S. in 1871. During the 1870s and 80s, he served in the Texas state legislature and held a number of local offices, including mayor of Dallas from 1885 to 87, which is when this book came out. When he died in 1895, his funeral was one of the largest the city had ever seen. And in 1912, a Dallas school was named for Brown. But in something that happened in 2006, which is really reminiscent of what's been going on here in Dallas lately, after attention was drawn to Brown's blatantly racist opinions, the name of the school was changed to honor Billy E. Dade, a local African-American educator. Another source I drew on was John Hughes Cochran, a former Dallas County postmaster, who also served as an assessor and collector of taxes, Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives, and in 1928, the year he died, the Service Publishing Company of Dallas published a book that he had been writing for the purpose of supplementing and correcting errors in Brown's book. Okay? And the title of this was Dallas County, a record of its pioneers and progress. Another source that I've drawn on is the Memorial Biographical History of Dallas, Texas. I'm sure you've all seen that big, huge vanity book that came out in 1892. However, a lot of what's in there about John Neely Bryan is simply a rehash of what was in Cochran's and Brown's book. So there wasn't anything in there really that was brand new. Same thing with Phillip Leslie's History of Greater Dallas and Vicinity. I have an original copy of that book, and it also draws heavily on Brown. Of all the sources that I've utilized, Frank M. Cockrell was probably the best one. And that's because Cockrell wrote one of the rarest history books of Dallas. It's called The History of Early Dallas. His name was Frank Merriam Cockrell. He lived from 1854 to 1935. It consists of articles that were first published between May 15th and August 28, 1932 in the Dallas Morning News. And although prior to his death in 1935, the elderly historian was preparing to publish this material, nothing came of it until 1944 when a nephew, Monroe F. Cockrell, gathered together his late uncle's work, added illustrations, and published a limited edition of only 20 copies. Now, I don't know where they all are today, but I do know where two of them are. One is in this building, upstairs, and the other is at SMU's Fondren Library. Those are the only two copies I'm aware of that are in Dallas County. I suspect some of them are in private hands. What makes Cockrell's work, however, more valuable than almost all these others that I've mentioned, is that as a young man, he not only knew John Neely Bryan personally, but also joined him from time to time whenever the Dallas founder traveled by horseback from his later home out at Big Spring into the city he had established, and therefore heard at first hand any accounts that Bryan may have shared with him. So, anybody that looks at the works of Brown and Cochran and Cockrell, it's easy to see, once you take a look at these works, it's easy to see that anybody who ever wrote about John Neely Bryan or any other aspect of Dallas history is deeply indebted to this trio, Brown, Cochran, and Cockrell, and including, but not limited to, Atchison and Rogers and Green and all those others. And I too have leaned pretty heavily on those. I want to acquaint you too with some other people who've written about John Neely Bryan in Dallas. W.S. Adair and Gus Ford were both Dallas Morning News columnists who wrote about Dallas. Adair wrote a number of sketches in the 20s and 30s. And in 1941 and 42, Gus L. Ford wrote a series of articles called Dallas Long, Long Ago. And one of the things that makes Ford a little bit different from some of these journalists who were writing about Dallas is he actually did a little original research, which is really good. But most of them didn't. Most of them just went back and looked at the old history books and just regurgitated what was already there. Now, another couple of people, of course, who contributed to our knowledge of John Neely Bryan was his son, John Neely Bryan Jr., who is seen here, with a portrait of his parents that he presented to the Dallas County Pioneer Association in 1925, this famous picture that I'm sure you've all seen a million times before. And also Margaret Beeman Bryan herself, John Neely Bryan's wife, was interviewed by newspaper reporters, and she also added to our knowledge of John Neely Bryan, of course, because she was married to them. Now, there's a problem, though, even with these sources. When Margaret Beeman Bryan was interviewed, she was very, very old. It had been a long time since pioneer days, and just how accurate her memory was is questionable. Also, John Neely Bryan Jr., we have to remember too, was either not born or an infant when a lot of the events that he talked about happened. So he got them obviously secondhand from either his mother or his father. But here's the thing that really strikes me. John Neely Bryan lived until 1877. Why didn't anybody ever interview him? That's a question I've wondered about. And why didn't he write any memoirs? He was literate. We know he was literate. He wrote letters. Some of them have been preserved. But they were just letters that were writing about things that were going on at the time. He never mentioned anything about the founding of Dallas or any of that other stuff. And nobody thought to sit down and say to him, hey, John, tell us about how Dallas was founded, and tell us about your early life and all this other stuff. The only person, as far as I know, who ever wrote about John Neely Bryan, who actually ever spoke to him personally, was Frank Cockrell. Well, anyway, to cut to the chase, in my book, what I tried to do is bring all this material together. And one of the things you'll find when you read my book is that I have made in some of the chapters comparisons of the various stories from the different sources and quoted them so that you could read for yourself, here's what Cockrell said, here's what Brown said, here's what John Neely Bryan Jr. said, and of course I've tried to analyze them and say, this one is more likely, here's what's wrong with this one, and so on and so forth. And then combine it into a comprehensive whole. So like I say, this is the first book, other than Trent's, where you can get the whole story about John Neely Bryan. And of course, my book is much more thorough than Trent's. Okay, this slide says, some old stories questioned, some mistakes corrected, and some new stories found. So that was my job, to take all this material. By the way, most of this material was never like I said, never footnoted. The sources weren't cited. A lot of it was anecdotal. And if you've ever done family history, you know how that can go. Sometimes people get their facts mixed up. Sometimes people get confused about who did what and when. And so I discovered the same thing was true of John Neely Bryan. So while I was putting this together, I asked some questions. Is this story true? Is there any evidence to back it up? I did correct some mistakes when I found them. And I found some new stuff too. I had never heard about John Neely Bryan, so I want to share that with you right now. Okay, first of all, this is just a small thing really, but most of the sources say that John Neely Bryan was born in Lincoln County, Tennessee. Well, I found evidence that he wasn't. He was born in Tennessee, but in a different county, Bedford County, which is near Lincoln County. And I think what happened is the family moved to, well, I do know they did move to Lincoln County later on, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence that they were actually living there when John Neely Bryan was born. But that's a small thing, really. Now, one of the things that Lucy Trent says in her book, I want to read you this part from my book where I mention this. According to Trent, and by the way, I do this a lot in my book, if I can't confirm something, or even if I can, if somebody said it, I'll say who said it. Okay, so you know, because in these other, sources, you're not going to necessarily get that. So, according to Trent, John and his brother James were enrolled at the Fayetteville Military Academy in 1825. Now, why did she think that? Well, because he lived in Fayetteville, Tennessee. Okay? So, she said that they were enrolled in the Fayetteville Military Academy in 1825. She tells us further that the following year, the two lads had the opportunity to see at close quarters General Andrew Jackson, who was feted at a local Independence Day celebration. Unfortunately, the first of these assertions cannot possibly be true. Why? Because there was no military academy in Fayetteville, Tennessee. Now there was, and still is, as far as I know, a Fayetteville Military Academy in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which opened in 1865. 40 years after John Neely Bryan supposedly went there, and in Tennessee as well. Well, anyway, so as I say, of course, by that time, John Neely Bryan was long past school age and living in Texas. Trent confused the two towns. It's obvious. This is an example of where I say people sometimes make assumptions based on similar names and things like that, especially place names. So obviously, Trent confused the two towns. Now, it is possible, however, that John Neely Bryan and his brother did see Andrew Jackson, because it is a fact that Jackson did visit Fayetteville, Tennessee on July the 6th, 1826, following visits to two other towns in the region. So that is possible. They may have seen him. It could have happened. Now, another thing Trent talks about is she says that John Neely Bryan, as a young man, did military service in the Seminole Indian War. Let me read you this. Trent says further that in the spring of that same year, 17-year-old John Neely Bryan got a brief taste of military life when he enlisted as a 3 months volunteer in a company formed to fight the Seminole Indians in Florida. She adds that by the time the company, which consisted largely of young men like him, reached Jacksonville, the Indians were no longer on the warpath. Consequently, young Bryan and his comrades were mustered out of service. Trent goes on to write that on account of their being adventurous young men and in no particular hurry to return to Tennessee, John and a friend, Ed Booker, decided to take the long way home through Georgia to South Carolina, where they stopped to visit some of John's kinfolk still living in the Pendleton district. Okay. Well, one problem with this story is that although there were 3 Seminole Indian Wars in the early 19th century, none of them occurred in 1828, which is when he would have been the age she said. Now, if the rest of the tale is true, John Neely Bryan and his friend Ed did go to South Carolina. For whatever reason, whatever happened next is simply incredible. Okay? Trent says that John Neely Bryan, on his way back home, stopped in South Carolina, and in a very unlikely scenario, the 2 youths were riding through a forest when they came across an Indian girl who had fallen off a cliff while picking berries. In this unlikely scenario, which sounds as if it came straight from the pages of a 19th century romance, the pair were amazed to learn that the girl spoke English and that her name was Elizabeth Neely Adair. Explaining that she was the granddaughter of a Scotsman who lived in North Carolina and his wife, a so-called Cherokee princess. It turned out further that the girl was a distant cousin to John Neely Bryan. Taking her home, they met her parents and a brother named Jim. While visiting her for a few days with the family, it soon became apparent to all that John and Elizabeth were falling in love. Eventually and reluctantly, young Bryan and his friend departed for Tennessee, taking with them some animal skins given to them by Elizabeth's father, John Adair, to trade for him in Memphis, where he hoped they would fetch a good price. Bryan also agreed to meet Adair in August to give him his money. Well, in Memphis, Trent tells us, Bryan traded the skins as promised. Then in August, he went to the appointed meeting place, a Cherokee trading post called Ross's Landing, which is at present-day Chattanooga, operated by Chief John Ross in partnership with a white man named Timothy Meigs. But John Adair, who was ill, sent his son Jim and daughter Elizabeth instead. Although the 2 young lovers were overjoyed to see each other, their happiness was short-lived. Shortly after, Elizabeth and Jim returned to South Carolina. Bryan learned that his sweetheart had died from the injuries she had suffered in her fall from the cliff. Now, how she was able to get up and walk around all the other stuff in between is beyond me. Anyway, let me go ahead and read you what I concluded here. While the likelihood of Bryan stumbling upon an injured girl in the wilderness, who also happened to be his cousin, may seem remote, history is full of improbabilities that actually occurred. Now, let me give you an example. When the Indian guide Sacagawea was traveling with Lewis and Clark, she chanced to meet her own brother out in the wilderness. This is up in the Rocky Mountains. This actually happened. It's incredible as it might seem. Or here's another one. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day. Did you know that?
Yes.
Do you know what day it was? The 4th of July. And it wasn't just any 4th of July. It was the 50th anniversary. Now, how incredible was that? But it actually happened. So what I'm trying to say here is improbabilities can happen. Can happen. And I go on to say here, interestingly, this story does contain some factual information. As it turns out, there was a young part Cherokee woman named Elizabeth Neely Adair who lived in the southeastern United States in the early 19th century. Furthermore, she did have a brother named Jim. But that's where the resemblance ends. Elizabeth Neely Adair would have had to, was only 3 years old in 1828. And in addition, her father's name was Walter Scott Adair, not John. Moreover, she did not die young, but married in 1843 a man named Timothy Meigs Walker. So anyway, unfortunately, while Trent gave credit to a number of sources in her book, she failed to specify which person told her this particular story or provided her with any other particular bit of information. So this is the sort of thing I was looking at, and so it's probably not true. Probably like John Smith and Pocahontas, having a love affair. Disney would have you think that, but it didn't actually happen. Okay, here's another one that might shock you. John Neely Bryan and his wife Margaret may not have actually been legally married. That is addressed in my chapter here, The Early Days of Dallas. Frank Cockrell said that John Neely Bryan and his bride rode on his pumpy, Neshaba, up to Bonham, or Fort English as it was called then, and that's where they were married. But here's a problem. There is no marriage license in that county. There's not one in Dallas County. There's no marriage license anywhere. There's no marriage certificate anywhere to back up that John Neely Bryan and his wife were actually legally married. Other people have said they got married in Dallas. Some people said they got married in Bowie. Some people said they got married in, as I said, in Bonham. The trouble is there's just too many stories, and they don't all match. So which one is correct? Well, the problem is I don't know. That's one of the things I had to address in this book, is which of these stories is correct. And the trouble is, there just isn't any hard evidence to back up any of them. So it's a possibility that John Neely Bryan and his wife were never actually legally married in the traditional sense, in the sense of the word. Just don't know for sure. Okay, so what else? Oh, here's one. John Neely Bryan and his wife at one point were divorced, if they were ever actually married. This is something I came across, which I'm going to try to find it here. I have all these things marked. I've lost it now. Early days in Dallas. Hold on. Yeah, I came across a curious account in the Dallas County deed records of all places. I don't know if you've ever, by the way, deeds are a great source of information. And why this was in the deed records. Have any of you used that Rome system? Are you aware of this? The Dallas County has this online database. It's called Rome, R-O-A-M. Stands for something, I guess. And you go in there and you can go back all the way to the very beginning of the county and look at the deed records. And I did, and I came across this. Let me read you what this says. This is really interesting. This is on file in the Dallas County deeds, dated September 20th, 1854. Articles of agreement, bargain, and contract made and entered into and between John Neely Bryan and his wife Margaret Bryan, witnesseth that the said parties, having for a number of years lived together in the relation of husband and wife. Now notice it says having lived together in the relation, it didn't say they were married. Having lived in the said relation to each other, husband and wife, and being now well convinced and satisfied that they cannot consistently live in the said relation to each other any longer, difference of a serious character having arisen between them, and of such a nature as to forbid them living in that harmony, which alone renders the marriage relation desirable, therefore it is mutually agreed by and between the said John Neely Bryan and Margaret Bryan that they will separate and no longer recognize each other as husband and wife, that from and after the signing of this agreement all their ties of affection for each other shall be sundered, and both acknowledge themselves free from any control of the other. In testimony whereof we hereto set our hands and affixed our seals, this 20th day of September 1854, J.N. Bryan and Margaret Bryan. How about that? So, let me read you what I wrote about this. Although this agreement, which was made only 2 weeks before the birth of the couple's 5th child, on October 3rd, was not officially referred to in the record as either an annulment or a divorce, it seems clear it was intended to have the same effect. Perhaps neither term was used because the couple had only lived together in the relation of husband and wife. Does this mean then that the Bryans might never have been legally wed? The complete absence of a marriage certificate in Dallas, Fannin, or Nacogdoches counties, the 3 places where their wedding is supposed to have taken place, certainly lends weight to the possibility. Precisely what happened to cause the Bryans to break up has been lost to history. But clearly the separation was not permanent, because there is ample evidence that in time, the couple resumed living together in the relation of husband and wife. So, they did, because you can go back and look at the census records, and obviously they were living together as husband and wife when you look at the 1860 and 1870 census. So, this divorce or annulment or whatever it was, was not continued. Now here's another thing. There's always been this big debate, I'm sure you've heard of it, who was Dallas named for, right? And if you read John William Rogers, and if you read, I guess, Sam Addison, and a lot of people, they say that John Neely Bryan, get to it here, that John Neely Bryan, well, let me read you what it says, what I wrote. For more than 50 years, it has frequently been said that when a young Frank M. Cockrell asked John Neely Bryan for whom he named the city, Bryan is supposed to have cryptically replied, "My friend Dallas." It appears that this story originated with the Works Progress Administration's Dallas Guide in History, which was written in the early 1940s. Although the guide was not actually published until 1992, researchers have always had access to the original manuscript, which was deposited with the Dallas Public Library when the WPA ceased operations in 1942. In all likelihood, one of the people who examined it was author John William Rogers, who in 1960 included the story in his book, The Lusty Texans of Dallas. But Cockrell never said that Bryan told him he had named the city for my friend Dallas. Here is what he actually wrote. This is Cockrell. We find him next studying law at Nashville, that is John Neely Bryan. Later, he was a licensed lawyer in Tennessee. It was at this period of his life that probably he first met George Mifflin Dallas, in whose honor the city of Dallas and county were named. Now, George Mifflin Dallas, as you may or may not know, was vice president under James K. Polk. The family records are that Mr. Dallas and John Neely Bryan were friends. After careful research, I am convinced they were friends, or at least acquainted. So that's not quite the same thing as saying, I named the city for my friend Dallas. Not surprisingly, once people figured out that Cockrell was mistaken, owing to the fact that Dallas, a Pennsylvanian, was never in Nashville during the time that Bryan lived there, speculation regarding the origin of the city's name became rife. And I devote an entire chapter to the debate about where the name Dallas came from as the name of the city, because the city predated the county. And there is ample evidence. You see it on maps, you see it in newspaper reports and other documents where this was being called Dallas long before Dallas County, good 5 years before Dallas County was formed in 1846. And it is held that Dallas County was named for the vice president because they wanted to name it after President Polk, who was president at the time, but another group of citizens got that name first, so they settled for Dallas. But the name Dallas was already attached to this city, or town as it was then, long before there was a county of Dallas. So, if you want to know more about the mystery of Dallas's name, it's in my book. I'll just tell you, it's still a mystery. Although I have my opinions, which I've mentioned. Now here's another one. The log cabin in Pioneer Plaza. I was brought up to believe that was John Neely Bryan's cabin. It was the first house in Dallas. Well, it isn't. It is almost certainly not the first cabin in Dallas, and nor is it likely that it belonged to John Neely Bryan. And this is not original to me. This is actually Barrett Stephen Sanders, who back in the 1980s wrote about this and did a very thorough job of researching it. And I covered this pretty thoroughly in my book about how he did this. But John Neely Bryan's first cabin was swept away in a flood. Okay, so that one there can't possibly be it. And the second one, if I'm not mistaken, suffered the same fate. So then who does this cabin belong to? Well, that's also covered in my book in the last chapter, which is called That Controversial Cabin. Now let me tell you why people have accepted it as the John Neely Bryan cabin. I'll just read to you again from the book here. Although this tiny wooden structure was almost certainly constructed about 150 years ago or more, it appears that it did not come to public attention until 1903, when an article appeared in the Dallas Southern Mercury, wherein the Reverend R.C. Buckner of the Buckner Orphans Home and the founder's son, John Neely Bryan, Jr., both hailed it as the earliest dwelling in Dallas. Thus the myth began. In the same article, which erroneously held that John Neely Bryan had once lived on a farm near Grand Prairie, Buckner remarked that the old cabin is in an excellent state of preservation, had been moved out to White Rock during the Civil War, and afterward, on December 25, 1880, it was relocated to the grounds of the orphanage, where Reverend Buckner and the other founders of the institution had held a formal dedication ceremony, and they went on to call it the dedication cabin. 23 years later, in the fall of 1926, the rustic dwelling was moved from the orphanage and temporarily displayed on Implement Row at the State Fair of Texas, where John Neely Bryan, Jr., then 80 years old, occupied it each day, entertaining fairgoers with tales of the early days of Dallas. Ironically, the cabin in which he claimed to have been born, indirectly killed him. How? Well, 2 months after the fair, he died of complications. And by the way, I'm going to the fair after this, so I better be careful. 2 months after the fair, he died of complications resulting from a case of food poisoning. He contracted it after eating food from a state fair concession stand.
Was it fried?
Don't say corny dog.
Wasn't a corny dog. Fletcher's corny dogs didn't appear until the 1940s. I forget what it was, but it wasn't a corny dog. Anyway, so there you go. Oh, sorry. Another thing that has been said about John Neely Bryan is that he gave away more city lots than he sold. That is absolutely flat out wrong. That is just not true. And the first person to try to put that rumor or story to rest was actually, what's his name, Gus Ford, back in the 1940s. I came across an article where he disputed that. He said, I got into the deed records, he said, and I checked it all out. And no, it's not true. Yes, he did give away some lots to some close relatives for love and affection, $1 in love and affection or something like that. But that was rare. he sold more land than city lots than he gave away. So that is just not flat out true. And I even did Gus Ford one better. I went into Rome and I made myself several Excel spreadsheets. And I found every single, I think I did, as far as I know, I found every single deed record that had anything to do with John Neely Bryan, buying or selling. And I even tallied up how much he earned every year and how many lots he sold. It's all in the book if you want to read that information. But I went in there and I just wanted to make sure that that was correct. And yes, Ford was correct. John Neely Bryan was a much better realtor than we've given him credit for. Finally, John Neely Bryan did not serve in the 18th Texas Cavalry, CSA, but his son did. One of the things that and this is unfortunate, you know, as I say in the book, once you put something in print, if you make a mistake, it's there for all time. You know what's even worse is when you put it, engrave it in stone. One of the things I discovered in my own family history is my grandfather is buried out in a little cemetery at the corner of Walnut Hill and Harry Hines Boulevard. I think they bought a plot because it was way out in the country in those days and it was cheap. My grandfather's tombstone says that he was born in 1879. And I couldn't find him in the 1880 census with his parents. I thought, well, that's funny, where is he? Well, it's because the census was taken in June of 1880. He wasn't born until August. 1880, not 1879. So you've got to watch out. My grandmother, I guess who provided the information, thought her husband was a year older than he actually was. But it's engraved in stone, you know, and the only way to change it is to put a new tombstone there. Well, they did the same thing with John Neely Bryan. Back in 2006, in 2006, let me read you this. In late October 2006, a grave marker identifying Bryan Sr. as the founder of Dallas, Texas, was erected in the cemetery at the Texas State Hospital, where he died in 1877. And in case you didn't already know this, I'll go ahead and let the cat out of the bag. John Neely Bryan died in the State Insane Asylum in Austin in 1877. And nobody knows exactly where he's buried, and probably never will. But in any case, as I said here, in October 2006, a grave marker identifying him as the founder of Dallas, Texas, was erected in the cemetery at the hospital where he died and formally dedicated at ceremonies which included several Bryan descendants. Unfortunately, the marker errs by identifying Bryan as a private in the 18th Texas Cavalry, the unit in which his son, John Neely Bryan Jr. served. And how do I know that? Because I looked at John Neely Bryan Jr.'s military record and his Confederate pension record, and they both identify John Neely Bryan Jr. as the one who served in the 18th Cavalry, 18th Texas Cavalry. And even the death date on the marker is probably erroneous. Frank X. Talbert, who you probably heard of, he's famous for his love of chili, Dallas Morning News columnist of old times. He went down to Austin and he looked at the records and he said that Bryan died on September 18th, 10 days later than the date on the marker. Anyway, as I go on to say, unfortunately, the stone does not mark the exact site of Bryan's burial, which is presently unknown and is likely to remain so. But a lot of people think he's buried in Pioneer Cemetery because there's a marker there that was put up in 1954. But it's erected to the memory of John Neely Bryan. It doesn't say he's buried there. And also, John Neely Bryan Jr. is buried in Wichita Falls, along with his mother at Riverside Cemetery. And it's easy to get the impression that he's buried there too, but he isn't. I'll conclude by reading the last paragraph of my book. called If You Seek His Monument. Will the remains of John Neely Bryan, as John Henry Brown proposed, ever be brought to Dallas to repose beneath a monument, plain but durable? Presently, it is unlikely. However, if the marker in Pioneer Cemetery seems unsatisfactory to you, here is a suggestion. Go to downtown Dallas and stand on any street corner. There where the tall glass and steel buildings of modern-day Dallas cast their shadows over Bryan's bluff. Think of the words inscribed in Latin on the tomb of Sir Christopher Wren, who was buried in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, acknowledged as Wren's masterpiece. Recall those words and you will realize that they apply equally well to John Neely Bryan. Si monumentum requiris circumspice, which means, if you seek his monument, look around you. Thank you very much. One more thing. If you wish to buy my book, there's some flyers that were passed around. Hopefully you got one. There's some out on the table. It is for sale on Amazon.com. That is the only outlet. Amazon.com, $15.99 plus tax and shipping. And I also have a couple other books I want to plug. From Water Supply to Urban Oasis, which was mentioned by Lisa in the introduction. This is a history of White Rock Lake Park. If you're interested in that. This is the Centennial Edition that I wrote. My original edition came out in 2004, and then I did some more additional research, and so this is an expanded version. It came out in 2011, which is the Centennial of Dallas. Dallas's favorite lake. As I like to call it, the best damn lake in Texas. That's D-A-M. Okay, because there's a dam. Okay. And you know there's only one natural lake in Texas. Anybody know which one it is? Very good. You guys know your stuff. Okay, and then I also have a book I just came out with this year. It's called Guided by Reason, The Golden Age of Free Thought in Texas. And it's got a chapter in here called the Dallas Freethinkers. And if you're interested in Denison, the infidels at Denison. So, and both those were originally articles in Legacies. All right, well, my work here is done. I guess I have a question.
Yes, first of all, thank you, because I actually came upon a stash of old Dallas history books from Phillips to like about Rome. And I will say that the Lusty Men of Texas, I mean, it's a good read, y'all want to read it. I only believed about half of what they said or anything like that. But that Rome database, the titles, the City of Dallas deeds, is that under the City of Dallas website, or where did
That's the county of Dallas.
Dallas County, thank you.
Dallas County, not the city.
Okay.
And so we cover deeds, not just in Dallas, but everywhere in the county.
Right, okay. So
Right, and it goes back to the 1840s.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. By the way, I just wanted to say one more thing. It just had occurred to me. One of the things too that sets my book apart from all these others is it's the first book that's written by somebody who's actually trained in history. All these other books, not to knock them or anything, but and this is true of other cities, not just Dallas. A lot of the early histories were written by journalists. It's the newspaper guys who went out there and interviewed people and asked questions and stuff like that, back before there were any trained professional historians. And so I think we owe them a debt of gratitude. But unfortunately, they didn't always tell us where they got their information from. And they just often accepted anecdotal stuff without checking it out, which is unfortunate. So that's why I tried to improve on what they did. It was the best I could.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? No? Well, then let's have the raffle, shall we? I'm going to give away a free copy of this. You want me to do the raffle?
I'll let you.
Okay. There we go. Just mix them up a little bit in here.
Make it a good.
Make it a good one. Okay, here we go.
All right.
It's blank.
Right here. Oh, no, we got the number.
Oh, it's a number. Oh, we're going by numbers.
Yes.
Okay. I thought if people were writing their names up, because there's a thing for name and address. Okay. Ready? Here we go. 418-6723.
2-3.
723 are the last.
2-3.
Nope.
Right? Come up and get your prize. If you have a pen, I'll inscribe it. I said, if you have a pen, I'll inscribe it. That is it. You got the one. And you want me to make it out to Travis? Today is the 13th, right? Here we go. Congratulations. No, I don't have any books to sell, but you can get them, like you say, on Amazon.com. I hope we'll see some orders.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, everybody, today. Have a safe trip back, and hope everybody enjoyed the presentation. Great Saturday. Thank you.
Thank you.
This recording has been made possible by the Dallas Genealogical Society. If you're already a member, thank you very much. If you're not a member, please consider joining and supporting activities such as this. Just go to our website, dallasgenealogy.org, and click on the membership tab.